everyone, welcome to part 2 of our podcast about parallels between famous English literary works and Reylo. If you haven't listened to part 1, where we talked about Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, we strongly suggest you do so, since we will be referencing some things for part 1 here. Once again, I'm your host Irina, and with me today are Lee and Chandra.
So next book we're talking about, this feels like a book club, this is amazing. Okay, so next book we're talking about is the very well-known Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I think we can agree that Pride and Prejudice is very much enemies, sort of enemies, it's complicated to lovers. Well, the thing with Pride and Prejudice and Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy's dynamic is that we have Darcy, who deeply admires Lizzie, even if she's totally oblivious to it, and she just stands by her first impression of him. And it's interesting to know that Pride and Prejudice, in the first drafts, it was originally called First Impressions. On the other hand, for the sequel trilogy, well, we have Rey, who's kind of our Lizzie character here, and she absolutely hates Ben, at least at first, because, well, kind of like Lizzie, they don't understand him, really. Like, Lizzie is kind of clinging to her first impressions, and we know that Rey, the reason why she hates Ben, a lot of people said when past that she hates him because he killed her father figure, but it's not so much because he killed her father figure, because she knew Han for like a few hours or something, but it's mostly because she doesn't understand, why did he kill his father. So yeah, there's that aspect, and their relationship at first is really rooted in this misunderstanding and, this prejudice, as you would say. And, you really see in the sequel trilogy that miscommunication is the real root of the Skywalker family's problems. And it's not that much Snoke. The miscommunication was already there, and Snoke just started playing with it, kind of amplified it and everything. And it's very much a continuing theme with Rey and Ben, and, they seemingly reach an understanding during The Last Jedi, but, after a throne room and big fight and everything, and, with Ben who wants to take the lead on First Order, well, obviously there's a lot of work to do. But on a lighter note, miscommunication is a trope that's very commonly used in rom-coms. It's used in Much Ado About Nothing, and Much Ado About Nothing is the Shakespeare play that's probably the grandmother of all rom-coms. And when it comes to Shakespearean influence in the sequel trilogy, I think the play might have been an inspiration for Han and Leia. And Pride and Prejudice, on the other hand, it's pretty much the mother of all modern romantic comedies, and for me that's the reason why it's the Austen novel that has aged the best. So next topic we wanted to talk about is points in common Darcy and Ben have. So I don't know if any of you want to start.
I would say that there are a lot of similarities between Ben Solo, Kylo Ren, and Mr. Darcy, and I don't think that it's a coincidence. I will make a confession that I think is not going to shock anybody who's listened to me speaking before in any of our podcast, but I've had a crush on Mr. Darcy since I was like 14 years old, and I've just never grown out of it. And I think that's true for most women who are familiar with Mr. Darcy. There's a reason why we call that the Darcy age, which is the age of Adam Driver. He's an actor in his early 30s who is portraying a character that is 29 when we first meet him. And it's called the Darcy age because it's the age where you appeal to pretty much everybody young enough that the younger women are going to be attracted to him without feeling grossed out, feeling like they're attracted to a guy who could be their dad. And then the older women can be attracted to him without feeling guilty about wanting to bang him. So the way that they've designed the character, this is something that we've talked about in more detail, specifically in the podcast that's called Why Reylo Belongs in Star Wars. We're talking about Kylo Ren's character design and why he is built to be a romantic male lead. He's made to maximize his appeal to pretty much everybody. Yes, little kids who want to wear the mask and play with the lightsabers, and older kids too, but also women, younger girls, older women. Everybody can find him attractive, just like Mr. Darcy. And there's a reason why, they've made sure that his hair is gorgeous and that it's a tall, handsome actor who has a handsome figure, the way they would say in a period drama. Also, a reminder that while Adam Driver didn't have to audition for the role of Kylo Ren because he was picked by J.J. Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy, Kennedy for the role. They weren't sure if he was going to sign up or not. He was very hesitant. So they were auditioning other actors to kind of have them as a backup plan. And what was it that they were auditioning with? It was Pride and Prejudice scenes. Things that make you go, is it a coincidence? I think not. Beyond the superficial physical aspects of the character design, then we look at the character himself. You have somebody who, both in Mr. Darcy's case and in Ben Solo's case, we're talking about a character who comes from a privileged family and who on the surface appears to be quite a snob, and he is. But even the snobbery is not like a toxic snobbery. It's more like something you can roll your eyes at. We see it when we first meet Mr. Darcy. You basically have Darcy arriving at this ball where it's obvious that he is the most distinguished and important person there, and he's more aware of it than pretty much anybody else. And he makes his disdain known. I mean, he's walking around with this snooty, detached expression, complaining to Bingley, "Oh my god, this party sucks. Ugly women everywhere, peasants everywhere. Where did you bring me? I'm not gonna dance." And then when he encounters Lizzie, he's like, "She's tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me." And who does that remind us of? It reminds me of Kylo Ren saying, "You a scavenger?" And then also saying to Snoke, "By the grace of your training, I won't be seduced." I mean, it's the same thing. Basically, Darcy is saying that he's unseducible by Lizzie, and Kylo Ren is proclaiming that he's not going to be seduced by anyone. And of course, Rey proves him wrong, just as Lizzie proved Darcy wrong. We have two characters that have reasons to be proud because they are exceptional. They are, in the sense of talents or wealth or being distinguished, they are more graced with these gifts, but at the same time, they're using some of that arrogance to disguise their vulnerability. With Darcy, he later explains to Lizzie that he is shy and he doesn't find it easy to talk to other people. She has no compassion for him. She's like, "Well, practice." And then with Ben Solo and Kylo Ren, we know that deep down he has a fear of not being good enough or being weak, not being strong, being foolish like his father. And so he uses this arrogance as a shield, and he uses this hardened exterior to kind of protect the soft underbelly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's something else that was actually pointed out by Star Wars Connection member Emma. There's a similarity in the story arcs of Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice and Mr. Thornton in North and South. And it's that at one point in the story, the romantic heroine finds herself in a moment of profound crisis. And just when everything seems the most hopeless, that's when the romantic hero steps in and saves the day. And it comes as no big shock to the readers and the viewers, but the heroine is shocked. And as a result, she starts to reconsider him and starts looking at him a little bit more objectively, letting go of the prejudice that she held against him up until that moment. Now she can see that in spite of the fact that it goes against a trait that she thought was a core character trait of his, he is willing to make this sacrifice for her. With Darcy and Lizzie, Lizzie's little sister Lydia has left with Wickham and she's disappeared and everyone fears the worst. She could end up becoming a prostitute in London or something. And that would be devastating for Lydia and also for her family and for Lizzie. Darcy hates Wickham, and yet he can't just stand by and allow Lizzie and her family to suffer this fate. So he will set aside his resentment of Wickham and will actually step in and help Wickham indirectly, because in fact he gets him like this really nice cushy trust fund and monthly stipend and makes sure that, you know, he marries Lizzie's sister. And in doing so, he basically rescues the fate of the family. With Mr. Thornton in North and South, it's a little bit more complicated. Margaret has a brother who is a wanted man, accused of a crime he didn't commit. So he has to flee the country. He decides to return so that he can say goodbye to their dying relative and is going to escape on a midnight train. Margaret decides to walk him to the train station. Of course, she's spotted. It just so happens that a murder is committed in the train station and there's a whole investigation and there's a matter of finding a witness. And what does this lady know? Somebody identifies the lady who was sneaking around as being Margaret Hale. And it just so happens that Mr. Thornton is a magistrate. He has to decide on these matters. And it tells you basically that this is a man of high standing, of high morals, and a straight shooter. He's somebody who's going to uphold justice and make sure that things are done the way they should be. And yet he sets that aside, even though he believes Margaret to be guilty, because because he knows his description is clear that it was Margaret. He thinks that she's sneaking around with some dude, which in that day and age meant terrible things. She's not the woman that he thought she was, and yet he loves her and he can't let her be ruined in this way. So he forgives her and he covers for her. So he basically makes the matter disappear. Margaret never gets called in to testify. Her reputation is saved, and she can't tell him that it was her brother because his life depends on everyone thinking that he's died at sea years ago. So she's basically unable to explain anything to him. She suffers knowing that he thinks this way of her, but she's so impressed and moved and humbled by the fact that he cares enough about her that he still helps her, even though he thinks that she's a loose, amoral woman and a liar. He will still protect her and treat her as a lady and all this stuff. It's a moment of reckoning basically for the heroine where she has to really look at this man. You know what? He's not the monster I thought he was, even though he's done this and this and that I disagree with, patricide. He's still a good person deep down. He still has the capacity for being noble, being self-sacrificing, and letting go of the hatred and actually do something selfless. That's really important, I think. So with Kylo Ren, he hates the resistance ever since he was a little kid. We know that much because of Adam Driver's interviews. And yet, can his love for Rey be stronger than his hatred? That's the question. And for me, the answer based on what we've seen is that it's going to be yes. But I think that it will still be a shock for pretty much everyone if he does something selfless to protect her. I would be even more impressed with him, and I think so would Rey and so would the GA, if he actually did something to protect not her, but someone she loves that he cares nothing for. Kind of like the Darcy way, protecting Finn or Poe because it means that much to Rey. And it would be awesome if he thought that Rey and Poe were dating and he still rescued Poe because he loves Rey that much. I think that is the kind of grand gesture that we need to show everyone, including Kylo Ren, how much and how deeply he cares about Rey, that he's willing to set his selfishness aside. I don't think Rey's going to be shocked because she saw Ben already. She knows what's in there. The fine materials that Jane Eyre was talking about when she was pondering her love of Rochester. He's got this harsh exterior, but I know that inside of him are these fine materials and the capacity for virtue and generosity and kindness and love and all this stuff.
Yeah, as you said, I think by the end of The Last Jedi, there's no one who knows Ben as well as Rey does, and there's no one who knows Rey as well as Ben does. So for her, it won't be a big surprise, and I think for some people in the audience, it will be a surprise. But for Rey, it's pretty much, a confirmation of, she believed that, there was still good in him when she went for him on supremacy. So, it's pretty much confirmation that, she was right. And as Han said, well, women always figure out the truth. So, yeah, there's definitely that too. So
I think that quote is golden. What you just said,
yes.
At the end of The Last Jedi, there's no one that knows Ben as well as Rey does, and there's no one that knows Rey as well as Ben does. That's absolutely true. We should knit that into pillows and print it on t-shirts and send it out to all the haters' houses so that they can have it, physically look at it and absorb it. Yes, they have a connection and they've touched a deep part of each other, and I don't mean that sexually. But they know each other in a way that no one else does because they had that window into each other.
Yeah. We're going to continue on with one of the most infamous scenes in the history of British literature, and that is Darcy's very bad, terrible proposal. Yeah, we all laugh just think about it. So, Ben's very bad, terrible proposal, he mentions Rey's parents in a non-very complimentary way. He also mentions that she is nothing. I kind of explained it above, but, he still says she's nothing because he has no game whatsoever. And, Darcy, he's not faring very much better. He asks Lizzie in marriage while mentioning the faults of her family and her lower standing in society. But the problem is, Darcy thinks that, by pointing out, you're inferior to me, but I'm marrying you anyway, he's showing how generous he is, and he doesn't realize how stuck up he is.
Yeah.
So, when you look at it, in a less dramatic way, Darcy's proposal is absolutely hilarious, and the way Lizzie refuses is even more funny. So, yes, I mean, for now, we're all kind of heartbroken, and we can't really look at The Last Jedi in a more, let's say, light way. There are a lot of scenes in The Force Awakens that I look at it now and I laugh my head off. I kind of wonder if there's the part where, Rey closes the door of Falcon on Ben, and, people are all wondering, will they see each other again? And, we'll see 9, and then we'll see that scene again in Last Jedi and just laugh because we all know how it's gonna end and everything. So, yeah, but one thing I also also wanted to point out, and it doesn't really have any link with Reylo, but I thought of it while preparing the podcast, and I thought that was actually pretty funny. In context of Pride and Prejudice, it's actually ironic that, we have Caroline Bingley, the secondary character in Pride and Prejudice. For those who don't know, she's in love with Darcy, or more importantly, the status he has. And, she goes after him because she has the ambition of marrying him. So, one thing when you know the historical context in which Pride and Prejudice takes place is that, Austen mentions the Bingleys got rich thanks to trade. So, when you read the sentence got rich thanks to trade, you have to understand that the Bingleys are a nouveau riche family. So thinking of how, Lady Catherine has, reserves, let's say, on Lizzie, and how she intended to have her daughter Anne marry Darcy, it's actually pretty funny in hindsight. And that's actually one of the reasons why Bingley rents Netherfield Hall and probably intends to eventually buy it, because having an estate was something people from the merchant class did to be accepted among the English gentries. And, Caroline Bingley of Netherfield Hall did sound fancier than Caroline Bingley of X whatever street. So, having the estate secures Bingley and Caroline's chances of marrying well. Lizzie, on the other hand, her situation is kind of worse because her father, he's part of the gentry, the lower gentry, but she can't inherit anything because Longbourn, where she lives, it's handled from father to son, and since Mr. Bennet doesn't have any sons, it has to go to the cousins. So, because of that, you could say that Lizzie, if she doesn't marry, like Rey, she's considered to be nothing. So that's another parallel we can build as well. I talk too much.
No, that was great. The historical context as well of what you added in about their socioeconomic history or their lives, even as fictional characters, is very true. I just want to throw in just a brief comment because I agree with what you both said about Darcy's proposal. My only comment is from a cinematic perspective of Darcy proposing to Lizzie and Ben proposing in a way to Rey. It's been such a long time since I've read Pride and Prejudice. I really need to reread it again. But going from the film, any of the films, but the most recent film with Keira Knightley, you have this grandeur to the scenes in both cases. You have the beautiful rain and the lush greenery all around, and they're both wet, and the raindrops, the rain is dripping down their face from when they ran to wherever the little gazebo thing or whatever it was. And the same in the Supremacy. It's burning around them after their fight with the Praetorian Guard. It's burning around them, and you see the embers falling and some of the flames and the smoke. And I think that's interesting, the contrast of fire and water. And we've already seen fire and snow just in the sequel trilogies as well. But just cinematically, those are big, beautiful moments in a way, beautiful in a way to look at while it's not playing out through the dialogue so well for any of the characters. And so that's just my 2 cents.
I will say that I know that the proposal of Ben towards Rey in The Last Jedi really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Even people who are supporters of the connection between the characters and who want to see them end up together were just really taken aback. For me, I just have to say, anybody who thinks that he was harsh on her, please go back and look at Mr. Darcy's proposal to Lizzie. It was like a verbal smackdown, but at the same time, there are moments where your heart just kind of catches because it's romantic, and to see him kind of making himself vulnerable that way when he tells her, for me, that most ardently, wow. But at the same time, I fought against my family's expectations and your inferiority, and I fought it so hard, but I can't help it. I love you. It's shut up. And then when he tells her, you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your circumstances? He's an ass, it's terrible what he says. In the same way, Ben, and I don't think that, just like Darcy wasn't trying to insult Lizzie, but he did horribly. Ben wasn't trying to insult Rey. He was actually making a point about the fact that in spite of her being so inferior, to him, it doesn't matter. She is nothing, but not to him. And when he says please at the end, it's I think that people need to kind of give him a break and understand that he was really trying. It just comes out wrong.
He doesn't have a lot of social skills.
Yeah, I'm sure he's never proposed to anybody before, so, give him a break. But it's a really nice parallel. And of course, that the proposal has to be rejected, but we know that there's going to be, hopefully, opportunity for the better one, where he comes back humbled and is able to articulate a little bit better how he feels about her.
Yeah, he's gonna get coaching from Anakin.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so I think we covered everything we want to say about Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah.
The next book we're gonna move on is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, and of course, you all know Emily is Charlotte's sister, and it's the only novel she wrote. But for heaven's sake, what a novel! It even shocked people back then, and it's still shocking people today. Well, I have a lot to say about Wuthering Heights, but before I start, do any of you guys have anything to say about it?
I would say, I mean, I love Heathcliff, and he's one of those characters that breaks your heart because I wanted him to be so much better than he was. I felt like he disappointed me, but at the same time, I couldn't help but care for him and root for him in a way. But when you learn just how awful he is, it's like he's difficult to love, I think. And for me, I think he's like the more Kylo Renian, aspect. Like we've been talking about how the other romantic heroes are more like the Ben aspect in disguise, but with Heathcliff, it's like, it's tough, like he really is monstrous. And, still there's that side of him that you can understand and love and care for and kind of hurt for. So I do think that there's definitely a lot of similarities with Kylo Ren. Of course, we don't want the whole romance to play out that way. Mm-hmm. I think you've mentioned that you really love this story, Irina. So I'm just curious to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I do, because I remember when I read of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights when I was about at the same time. I think I was 15 when I both read them for the first time. When I was younger, I preferred Jane Eyre, but nowadays, now that I'm older and everything, I have to say my favorite book is Wuthering Heights. And of course, a lot of people in the fandom have compared, Kylo and Rey to Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw, but personally, I would actually argue they're Hareton Earnshaw, who is Catherine Earnshaw's nephew, and Catherine Linton, who is Catherine Earnshaw's daughter. So yeah, I think they're more Hareton and Catherine Jr., minus the cousin part, of course. So I just want to make a parallel here with Amidala, because there have been a lot of people who said that, Rey and Ben's story is basically Anakin and Padme's story, but reversed. And also one of the big reasons why the galaxy is in such a turmoil, even up to The Last Jedi, is partially because of Anakin's love for Padme. So in Wuthering Heights, the reason why the Earnshaws and Lintons get pretty much destroyed and torn apart is because of Heathcliff and Catherine, this really destructive, larger-than-life love for each other. So it's significant that, Heathcliff and Catherine's romance is very wild, also very selfish, and, it foils the very civilized Jane Austen-like Lintons. So Hareton and Cathy kind of represent this balance between those two extremes, like Heathcliff and Cathy and the Lintons. And what's significant is that we have a scene where, in the book, where Catherine actually teaches Hareton how to read, because he never learned how to read and everything. So where I want to get at is that we have one generation that messes up everything, and the root of it is selfishness. We got Anakin and Padme, and we got Heathcliff and Cathy. But the generation that comes after, or 2 generations later, however, it's the generation that fixes it, because they love each other selflessly. And that's eventually going to be Ben and Rey, and that's definitely Hareton and Cathy Jr., because what happens is that in the book is that Heathcliff pretty much destroys the life of everyone around him as revenge, and what ultimately is his demise is the fact that Hareton and Cathy, they team up together, and one of the reasons why, he's kind of defeated by them is that, they remind him a lot of Cathy Sr., but really the best sides of her, and that's what ultimately defeats him. So I think, yes, Ben and Rey are definitely Amidala in reverse, but I think that ultimately they're going to represent the best parts of Amidala.
That's a beautiful interpretation.
Yeah,
I love it.
I was going to say that's much more insight than I have for Wuthering Heights. I've trudged through it once, and I love certain elements of it, but that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's kind of sad because it's not very accessible. The points of view change often in the book and everything, and I know a lot of people were turned off by that. And also the other reason is that there's not really a good adaptation of Wuthering Heights. Well, there's the one with Tom Hardy and Charlotte Riley that's honestly pretty good. Tom Hardy does an amazing job as Heathcliff. He's really good as always. But other than that, the other adaptations of Wuthering Heights, they kind of range from okay to absolutely terrible. So that's kind of the problem with it as well. So,
I
okay.
liked Ralph Fiennes as Heathcliff, though. I really enjoyed his
definitely.
his portrayal.
Definitely. Yeah.
I don't know about Juliette Binoche.
Yeah, well, that's why I was saying, like, adaptations of Wuthering Heights range from, not too bad to absolutely mediocre. Like, there was a movie that was done in 2013 with Cayasco Delario. I'm probably not pronouncing her name right. And I watched it, and it was absolutely terrible. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Montgomery. I don't know if you still want to talk about it.
Yeah, I'll just for a brief minute. So, Anne of Green Gables is, a beloved young adult or even children's book. I still love it in my 30s, and I love the 1980s version of it. I haven't seen the newer version, movie or miniseries.
It's terrible. It's terrible. I hate it.
But here's another classic story of enemies to friends to lovers, and we'll just skip the ending. It's also a coming-of-age story. You also have Anne as an orphan, and so Rey is an orphan and Jane Eyre is an orphan. We've seen that already. What I really wanted to just briefly talk about is Anne and Gilbert. So once she's adopted into a family and she begins going to school, she meets Gilbert Blythe, and whenever I think of Gilbert, I think of young Gilbert with his hand propped up on his desk, just staring at Anne. And, he's teasing her and he's taunting her and in a kind of, the boyish way. But he is just kind of head over heels in love with her pretty much right from the start. Maybe not in love, but definitely crushing on her right from the start. And she's oblivious. He pulls her hair, the classic, schoolboy stuff. And, she's just angry at it. That's not necessarily Kylo and Rey because they're older and they have very different backgrounds and stuff. But when I think of Gilbert Blythe staring at Anne, surely, it reminds me of Kylo Ren in The Force Awakens, especially on Starkiller Base in the snow scene when the lightsaber goes to Rey and he's just staring at her in awe, and we all love that picture probably, and it's so beautiful, and so it's that same kind of idea I feel like is happening, that the crush, I feel like the crush definitely is stronger at the beginning, not that Anne or Rey or any of these women didn't feel it at the beginning, because I do think that Rey is kind of whoa, what's going on, when he unmasks and sees her. But I think it's definitely, it hits the males more, and so I like that aspect. Gilbert Blythe also proposes to Anne, and she turns him down the first time, and she's like, I love you dearly, and it's not as botched of a proposal, but she says, I want to go find my own way. I need to find who I am. I want a career. I want more education. I want you to have what you want. And so they endure a separation while they go fully find themselves as young adults, and then they come back together and eventually, do have their romance. And then the last similarity that I wanted to bring out is that Anne and Gilbert are both very strong-willed. They're prone to compete. They're very, very gifted, especially intellectually at school. They're often competing, and I think there's, that same kind of dynamic between Rey and Ben. They're equals. It kind of talks about equal, in the balance, and the light and the dark, and the light rose up to meet the dark. And then, of course, they're, both gifted with raw power, which we had never really heard of in the, we talk about the Force, but we never talked about raw power in the original or prequel trilogies. And so, it just kind of reminded me of some aspects with Anne of Green Gables, even if there aren't a ton of similarities.
So, okay, next thing we want to talk about, it's not so much yes, you could say it's a book, but we're going to talk about Romeo and Juliet, and more particularly an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet called West Side Story. It's a musical by Leonore Bernstein and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, and this is my musical theater nerd side coming out, and I'm gonna stop. I love Stephen Sondheim so much, guys. Okay. Okay, but anyway, I'm simply going to point out that when it comes to West Side Story, at some point on Twitter, Rian Johnson started posting videos of West Side Story.
Yay!
For no reason at all. Just posting videos of this amazing masterpiece of cinema. And, it turns out that, he wasn't just posting videos of this amazing masterpiece of cinema. It had something to do with The Last Jedi. So who wants to start talking about this amazing masterpiece musical? I'm gonna stop.
I know nothing of West Side Story. I'm like the opposite of a musical theater nerd. Like, I hate musicals. The only musical I've watched and loved is The Lion King, because there's an exception to every rule. So I'm going to defer to you guys.
Oh, Maria. Maria. Okay, I'm going to stop. Because otherwise I'm going to start singing tonight.
Well, I think I can just add in a couple of things, but since Irina loves the musicals so much, I will just be very brief, and then I'll let her really talk about what she loves. You have, this one is a bit more of the, less of like enemy, but there's the enemies to lovers aspect, but it's even more like forbidden love, and warring sides, and that just makes me think, like, what is going to happen when the resistance, like Finn, like Poe in particular, find out about the Force bond, and find out more about, what Rey's been up to, and Rey and Kylo and all of this stuff, and I don't think they're going to be particularly happy. And so that kind of stands out to me, because you obviously have Romeo and Juliet, and they're rendezvousing, and you have Maria and Tony as well. The last thing I could say is kind of just the secrecy, which it goes along with that, just the secrecy of their romances, and the secret rendezvous, and it just makes me think of the hut scene, and Luke bursting in, and he's so like appalled, of course, and what we famously call the smut hut. I don't know if we want that in the podcast, but I said it. But yeah, so there's, in some of the film adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, they're meeting out in the woods. So then again, we have the woods, of course, and of course that goes back further in time to Shakespeare and the stage play and everything like that. But they're meeting, they're holding hands. There's a lot of symbolism within, again, the way that these movies are filmed, and the cinematography and the choices that directors make, whether it's on stage or on camera and stuff like that. So that's what stood out to me.
Well, you summed it up pretty well. Good job. And anyway, I think one of the reasons why, Rian Johnson was posting those West Side Story videos is that there's this very, very famous scene at the end of the movies. Spoiler alert, but if you know how Romeo and Juliet goes down, it doesn't end well. So what happens is that, well, at the end of West Side Story, Tony dies at a moment where, the two gangs are confronting each other, and you have Maria, who, is all heartbroken, and, she kind of has this breakdown, and she says this very famous quote where she says, you all killed him, not with bullets or guns, with hate. Well, now I can kill too, because now I have hate. That's probably, for me, the most amazing quote in all of West Side Story. Not in a good way, but that's the quote that probably stayed the most with me. And one thing I think is absolutely beautiful with The Last Jedi is that, it's basically the anti-West Side Story. Just by looking at Rose's quote at the end of the movie, we're going to win this war not by fighting what we hate, but saving what we love. I think that's a message that's going to continue on with episode 9. So we have, Finn, who's willing to sacrifice himself for the resistance, just goes into the sort of mini Star Killer base to stop it from destroying the Crate base, and Rose saves him, even if it means almost sacrificing her life in the process. And I think that in episode 9, there's going to be conflict is going to be resolved not by, fighting what we hate, like the big confrontation between the First Order and Resistance, and on a more personal level, a confrontation between, Kylo and Rey. It's going to be really by stating what we love. So I think there's going to be that theme that's going to be really marking Rey and Ben's relationship in 9 and everything.
If you think about Star Wars, and I think this is something that kind of flies over the head of a lot of people when they're thinking about the sequel trilogy. When you think about Star Wars, remember that it is at its core the story of the Skywalker family and their saga, and remember that Ben Solo is really the last Skywalker at this point, because we know that Leia is going to be gone at some point in 9. So the family's whole arc, basically how it ends, will depend entirely on what happens with Ben Solo in episode 9. And what you've just said, and the quote by Rose, I think there's a lot of really neat potential foreshadowing there for the fact that Ben has really hung on to this hate and his anger and his hatred to make himself strong and to survive. And he's going to have to let go of that and set it aside and embrace love and choose not to fight against all this stuff, but rather to focus on saving what he loves, which probably will be Rey. So I think that would just be a perfect way to kind of tie those loose ends together and kind of bring home that message of the importance of even though I think it's so corny. It's such a corny quote, but it's one of those true things, you know. When she said it, I kind of rolled my eyes, but then I thought, but she's right, you know. So, and it definitely is. It would be like a really nice change of pace from always fighting. Well, let's focus on protecting, really figuring out what's important and what we're fighting for here.
Yeah.
So I think for Ben to, you know, come full circle in that way, it would mean that the Skywalker legacy would also come full circle in a way and correct what Anakin did.
Yeah.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to point out, though it's more on the superficial level, one thing I noticed while preparing for the podcast, and I can't believe I haven't noticed it earlier, is, you know, Rey with her hair down when she goes and sees Ben on the Supremacy. It's actually the exact same hairstyle as Maria's in the West Side Story 1961 film. I'm not even making this up. So I think it's definitely not a coincidence.
And like even the makeup seems very similar. Like there's a little bit of eye makeup, but it's very subtle. But yeah, I can see that.
So before we wrap up and you guys do your overviews, there's something I wanted to mention that I think ties in all of the works that we discussed earlier in our conversation with the sequel trilogy and the dynamic between Rey and Kylo Ren. And it has to do with the subject of sexuality and the story of young women coming of age, which I think is a topic that's very relevant when we talk about Rey and her hero's journey. We have seen a lot of imagery in The Force Awakens and also in The Last Jedi that speaks to the symbolism of a young woman dealing with these inner drives that are passionate, dangerous, and dark. That could be sexuality and sexual awakening. That scene in The Force Awakens where Rey is being chased through the woods by this dark figure that she is afraid of, but also powerfully drawn to the point that she's actually seen him in a daydream twice, by the way, before meeting him in her vision. And then when she comes face to face with him, it's terrifying, but also there's obviously a very charged magnetism, and that only develops more as they get to know each other. And then there's, of course, more symbolism. If you're interested in this topic, we already covered it extensively in our podcast about sex and force bonds. So how does this tie into what we've discussed? If you think about the stories that we talked about, they're basically about young women struggling with a passionate and powerful attraction towards a dangerous male figure that they are both drawn to and repulsed by to some degree. And all stories share similar themes, and they basically explore the themes by presenting a very interesting dichotomy. We're presented with a young woman who is the paragon of virtue and serves as an example for all the other women that she interacts with, and also for the reader. And then you have her polar opposite, which is a woman who has fallen and has been disgraced or debased because of not being able to resist the dark appeal of sex, basically not being able to remain pure or chaste. And aside from serving as a point of comparison to the virtuous heroine, they also serve as a cautionary tale to the women in the story and to the reader. For example, in Jane Eyre, you have Jane as the paragon of virtue, and then you have her polar opposite, Bertha Mason, Rochester's insane first wife. And I talked about Bertha Mason, the lady in the attic, as a symbolism for Rochester's baggage that's preventing him from uniting with Jane. And that's certainly one way to look at it, but as we know, things can have multiple meanings and interpretations depending on the context, that you look at them in. And Bertha Mason is really, that's commonly accepted interpretation, that she is the alter ego of Jane. Jane is, in her conduct and her words and her deeds, she's trying to live her moral and spiritual values, but at the same time, her nature and her spirit is fiery and passionate. So it's basically like she's in a war with herself, in conflict. Bertha Mason serves as a cautionary tale for Jane. This is your future. This is what can happen to you if you give in to that sexual frenzy that deep down you're capable of because of how drawn you are to Rochester in that way. It's not something that's spoken. It's not something that's named in the novel, but the idea is that Bertha Mason became so debased because of her sexual appetites, among other things, that she becomes a monstrous woman, railing so strongly against the oppression that all these women must exist within, that she becomes actually insane and has to be locked up in an attic. And there's a lot of sexual symbolism in the way that Bertha is presented and how others speak about her. The fact that she literally sets Rochester's sheets on fire. There's a lot of like subtle symbolism there. I like to think, obviously being someone who's got a huge crush on Freud, I like to think about Jane and Bertha as the superego and the id. Superego, rigid, maintaining order and structure and making sure that everything is adhering to strong moral principles and internal rules. And the id, contrasting that with primitive drives, passion, lust, violence, etc. So it's very interesting with them too. I actually really like the character of Bertha, as you can probably tell. I think she's just really interesting. One other reference that comes to mind for me immediately when I think of her is that she reminds me very much of one of my favorite poems ever, which is Kubla Khan by Coleridge. He describes this pleasure dome and the things that occur in it, and he says it a savage place that's haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. That visual that evokes reminds me so much of Bertha. And if you think about Kylo Ren, when you read that poem, that part where it says, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. I mean, you can't get more cautionary tale than that. Then you have, in Sense and Sensibility, which we briefly referenced, you have Eleanor Dashwood as the paragon of morality, and then you have Eliza, who has given in to lust, has become pregnant, has had a child out of wedlock, and eventually dies. Pride and Prejudice, you have Jane Bennet, and then you have Lydia, her younger sister, as the loose, fallen woman who has escaped with Wickham. In North and South, you have Margaret Hale as the idealized woman, and then you have two figures here that are very interesting. One is the fallen Margaret, which is not a real person. It's just Thornton's fear that that's what's happened when he learns that she was sneaking around with some man in the train. She doesn't really exist, but she is a cautionary tale. You can end up losing everything, your reputation for your family, etc. But really the contrasting figure there is Boucher's wife. She and her husband are so poor that their family is literally starving to death, and yet they keep having more and more kids. The husband is under so much pressure by the fact that he has to feed 7 people in his home that when there's a strike in the cotton mills, he ends up committing suicide, and that leaves the wife and her 6 children destitute. So the underlying message there is marriage won't save you. The idea is that sex is so dangerous that if you give into it, you can end up disgraced, you can end up insane, you can end up debased, destitute, etc. Now, how does this connect to Rey and Kylo Ren? What makes this dynamic between them so interesting is that their connection is operating on multiple levels. It's multifaceted. Yes, he is the Byronic figure to her passionate yet virtuous young heroine, the woman who's coming of age, who's grappling with these dark sexual impulses that we've discussed before. But there's another layer here, which is that Kylo Ren is the fallen Ben Solo. And if you think about the light side of the Force as chastity and virtue, and you think about the dark side of the Force as giving into sexual temptation, and then you think about Ben Solo falling to the dark side, becoming debased, becoming amoral, becoming disgraced, and falling, his life derailed. And you think about Rey observing this. Ben is serving as a cautionary tale for her about what could happen to her if she were to give in to the dark side. Fortunately, because we're talking about a fairy tale in space and not some Victorian era tragedy where the debased woman has no opportunity for rehabilitation or for redemption. In Star Wars, redemption is a key theme. So Rey is also serving now as an example for Ben, and she can, through her conduct, inspire him to reflect on himself, and maybe she can spark a change in him that he can then follow through with. Sense and Sensibility is one of my favorite Jane Austen stories, and if you think about Marianne Dashwood telling Eleanor, I compare my conduct to what it ought to have been. I compare it to yours. For me, that could very well be Kylo Ren speaking to Rey and reflecting on his past mistakes. Their connection is really layered in a very nice way. And by the way, I feel like this goes without saying, but I know we have people who hate watch us, and you guys leave lovely feedback. And before you pull out your pitchforks, like, disclaimer, when I say that the light side of the Force can be viewed as chastity and the dark side of the Force can be viewed as sexual debauchery, I'm basically making a symbolic interpretation. It's a metaphor, really. It's not like literally that's what the Force is meant to portray. It's just one way of looking at the sexual dynamics that are playing out. If you look at it from that standpoint, it actually connects with what we were talking about in our previous episode about chaste, virginal Luke being shocked and dismayed by Rey's curiosity and the fact that she's drawn towards that dark Force hole that looks so distinct distinctive, let's put it that way. The hole that leads to where Kylo Ren is and where they will engage in an intercourse of the minds. The last thing I'll say is that there's another similarity between the classic stories that we've been talking about and Star Wars, and it's that even though these stories are not erotic, obviously, they all contain erotic elements that cannot be expressed explicitly. So they have to convey these elements in subtle ways, and they rely heavily on symbolism and imagery. It's pretty clear, I think, in Jane Eyre in particular, that there is a powerful sexual undercurrent in the interactions between Jane and Rochester. The same way with Kylo and Rey, and like I said, we've covered that topic extensively, so we're not going to get into it too deeply now, but it's worth noting that things like charged gazes that are being held for a few seconds longer than they should be, really, and heavy breathing, gasping, and breaking the physical barrier with even casual touch can become heavily charged and meaningful in that way. And of course, the physical proximity of the characters, especially when they've come from being at complete odds. For example, in Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth is climbing into the carriage, she's leaving Netherfield, and Mr. Darcy comes and just grabs her hand and holds it so that he can help her into the carriage. They share a glance, and then, he walks away and he's flexing his hand. In North and South, when Margaret finally agrees to shake hands with Thornton, it goes from a handshake to hand-holding because they're both so reluctant to let go of each other's hands. And then, of course, in Reylo, we've talked about that finger porn moment where Kylo Ren, he actually removes his glove and his hand connects with hers and she gasps, and that conveys a new intimacy between them. And there's an obvious sexual undercurrent there. There are other ways that these stories convey, especially in the visual medium, because it's just easier to be subtle and yet clear when you're using film language. So when you have Elizabeth Bennet in Darcy's house looking at these gorgeous nude sculptures of men and women reclining, and her eyes linger over a shapely buttock or the curve of a waist, and then she goes over to the sculpture of Mr. Darcy and admires his countenance, and she acknowledges that, wow, he's hot. The message there is that obviously it has entered Elizabeth's mind and our mind as the viewer that he is a potential sexual partner for her, and that he's attractive, and that she would probably like to be intimate with him in that way. So it's very subtle. It's not going to be in your face. It's not Game of Thrones, but the sex is there. That is another interesting similarity.
So if we look at Jane Austen's approach to romance, well, we know that Jane Austen never married, even if she did reject a marriage proposal a night after accepting it. Of course, we have the movie Becoming Jane where, she has this romance. It's kind of made up a bit. Like, she didn't know a guy called Tom Lefroy, but we don't really know if they were really in love with each other or anything. So Becoming Jane, I really like it as a movie, but, it's not very faithful to Jane's real story and everything. However, one thing I can say about Jane Austen is that, her approach to romance is, let's say pretty no-nonsense. So the closest thing we get to a romance with a bad boy with Jane Austen, it's Lizzie and Darcy. It does remind me of, Mansfield Park, which is one of Jane Austen's, which is not as well known as Pride and Prejudice as an Austen novel, and it kind of makes me sad because it's probably the least loved of Jane Austen's novel because it didn't age very well. And I remember Jane Austen actually had this argument with her sister Cassandra and her niece Fanny Knight. Both Cassandra and Fanny Knight, if you know Mansfield Park a bit, they wanted Fanny Price, the main character of Mansfield Park, to end up with Henry Crawford, who was kind of the bad boy character. But, Jane, sadly, we don't have the full conversation, and I would have loved to know more about that conversation they had. But, Jane Austen was very insisting on, no, Fanny has to end up with Edmund, not Henry, and everything. So she wasn't very prone to, romances with bad boys as, the Bronte sisters were. And again, as I said, the closest thing we get is Lizzie and Darcy. But again, Darcy, it's not that he's bad. He's just a bit stuck up, and deep down, he's a good person. So,
I think you do see, bad boys, but as a cautionary tale.
Yes.
Like, you have Wickham, and then, of course, you have in Sense and Sensibility.
Willoughby, yes.
Willoughby, yeah. So she does know how to write a bad boy, but and to have him be romantically entangled, but it's not something to aspire to. It's something to kind of turn away from, in a way.
Yeah, and one thing I appreciate about the Sense and Sensibility adaptation with screenplay by Emma Thompson, the one and only, is that, first time I read Sense and Sensibility, I kind of wanted Marianne, to not be involved with anyone, because I just went, oh, Brandon is old. What is she doing with him? But, then I saw the adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, and, Colonel Brandon was Alan Rickman, and I said, okay, you have my blessing. It's Alan Rickman.
Yes!
But yeah, because I think the big thing with Jane Austen is that, her works, it's still very much ingrained into the convention of her time. A woman had to marry in order to be secure on a financial and social level, and, that's why Austen's novel revolved a lot around marriage. This said, Austen was among the first in British literature, and I repeat, British literature. I will not give you a masterclass on French literature here, even though the 2017 adaptation of Beauty and the Beast seriously needs it. I said it. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, Austen was among the first in British literature to give female characters a real agency in their own stories. And, it was something that was continued by the Bronte sisters. So, if I want to make a parallel with Reylo here, again, it's kind of hard to compare Reylo with other Austen romances because, as I said, Jane Austen, because, well, as you said, actually, Jane Austen wasn't exactly kind to bad boy types, and, like it or not, I like Ben, he's a sweetheart, but, he is kind of a bad boy archetype to an extent. Well, you see what I mean. So, yeah, that's pretty much the parallel I can make with Reylo here. That was terrible.
No, that was good. My two favorite Jane Austen novels are actually Sense and Sensibility. And by the way, when I thought you were going to start trash talking Brandon, I was going to be not on my watch. But my other favorite novel by her is Persuasion.
I love Persuasion.
It's a story about second chances. And I find those stories and songs about that, so moving and so satisfying emotionally. Like the Mariah Carey song, I Still Believe. There's something very deeply touching, I think, about the idea of two people who love each other, care for each other deeply, but for whatever reasons that first time they couldn't make it work. Maybe one of them or both of them needed to change, and so they separate and it's painful. Then time goes by and, they've grown into each other, they've matured as people, they've had a change in perspective. There was no chance that they could ever be together again, but they never forget each other, and then they encounter each other years later and the connection is still there, the love is still there, and this time they're able to come together and have faith in each other and make it work. I think that's beautiful. And I know the stories are very different, the Persuasion storyline and the Kylo and Rey storyline, but that idea about second chances, forgiveness, and faith in each other, I think that sounds super Reylo-tastic, and I think it would be very satisfying to watch that play out. But I can see what you mean about Jane Austen kind of being on a straight and narrow and warning young readers, careful with the bad boy, go for the person with the good morals, and avoid the bad boy because you're going to end up pregnant and dead.
I can't really fault Jane for having that perspective because, she was common sense in person, so,
But at the same time, you gotta wonder, what if she had, Mansfield Park would have been so much more interesting if Fanny had gone for the bad boy.
Yeah.
Because Fanny is so virtuous and so, fantastic and sweet. So it would have just been such an added layering if she had gone for this guy that she obviously had a great chemistry with him and that interesting dynamic.
The only way I can kind of accept Mansfield Park, really enjoy it, is that I kind of see it as a tongue-in-cheek parody of, the Samuel Richardson's novels, Pamela and Clarissa, where you have those impossibly virtuous and pure heroines, and, they were very popular back then, and I know Mansfield Park was very well received, but I kind of wonder if it's not a, tongue-in-cheek parody of Samuel Richardson's novels, just like Northanger Abbey was a parody of, the early Gothic novels that were all the rage back then, so when I see it with that perspective, Mansfield Park is a lot more enjoyable.
Okay, well, I'll just kind of wrap up on with Charlotte Bronte's approach to romance. So Charlotte Bronte is writing decades later, mid-1800s, and I just wanted to say a couple of things, but it kind of goes along with some of the stuff that we talked about with Jane Eyre in particular. So Charlotte Bronte emphasizes female agency a little bit more than Jane Austen, but Jane Austen does do that, like Irina was talking about. You get more of like this bolder language and phrases. I have independent will as a human, that Jane Eyre says to Mr. Rochester. And I think that that's a product of her time. Just going brief into history, the first like women's rights movement, the grandmother feminists you could even call them, were coming about and kind of culminating in the early and mid 1800s. So this is after Austen's time period, and so there is a little bit more of this kind of acceptable element of a female agency, even though it's still very controversial in the 1800s. And so tying that back to Star Wars and tying that back to Reylo and Rey, and kind of even just what you guys were talking about with the bad boy element and kind of developing that, Rey needs to have that agency. She definitely needs to have that. We've talked about it. You guys have talked about it before in other podcasts. That is a beautiful thing. Like, as much as it's so hard to watch the end of The Last Jedi, it really is the best place to leave off with that storyline that they did throughout the earlier parts of The Last Jedi, because like you guys just said, Ben has to change himself. He has some of the light, he's seen some of the light. She can, be some of the light to him, but she can't change him. And so she needs to have that agency, and that will make their love even stronger in the end, and it makes their love story even stronger in the end if they both have that agency, and he can change and she can say, okay, not yet, I can't settle for this yet, or I can't stay with you yet. So that's kind of tying it into Charlotte Bronte having that agency a little bit more prominent in her storyline. The other thing I wanted to say kind of ties to Charlotte Bronte herself, not just in her characters. Charlotte Bronte actually rejected a couple of men's proposals, actually. The first one, he was a family friend, and it's actually who St. John is based on in Jane Eyre, where she was like, yeah, I like you, but he was very theological. He wanted to go be a foreign missionary, the man in her real life, and he was like, come with me. And she's like, I'm not feeling it so much. The man that she eventually marries, this will tie to Reylo. The man that she eventually marries is Arthur Bell Nichols, and he proposed to her, and long story short, she rejects it. There is kind of a discrimination based on her family to an extent, and she just is kind of surprised. She's like, this came out of nowhere. Like, she's known Arthur Bell Nichols personally, living in close proximity. He works for her father in the church and all this stuff, but she didn't know that he felt that way. So when he's rejected, he ended up moving away. Like, he quit his job, he found another job elsewhere, and he moved away. And for months on end, I can't remember the exact space of time, but after he left, they began writing, Charlotte Bronte and Arthur Bell Nichols. They communicated without her father knowing, and they started writing, and she grew to love him through that period of separation and through that long distance communication. And I know that's getting like much more into her personal life and not the fictional level, but I mean that, Rey and Ben begin to communicate through the Force bond, and they begin to learn more about each other, and they begin to develop that bond and understand each other so much more. And there comes the friendship and, the kinship and possibly the love or future love. And so that is another way that I tie back Charlotte Bronte's own life and how she writes as well, her approach to romance to Star Wars and Reylo.
It's so good to have experts talking and doing a masterclass.
So that was a very interesting conversation. I actually learned a lot, and I hope you all learned a lot as well. Thank you so much, you guys, for joining. I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as we did. If you liked it, you can subscribe by clicking below. We're also on Mixcloud, Tumblr, Twitter. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below. We'll be happy to answer them. Even if you have any questions about Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters or whatever, we'll answer them. We'll be very happy to do so. Or, you can send us an email. We hope you have a nice evening or morning or afternoon wherever you are, and may the Force be with you.